Hello, and welcome to another episode of Yalla, the podcast of Jewish students brought to you by UJS. I'm Edward, I am president of UJS, and I'm joined today by
I'm Levona, president of the Aberdeen JSOC, and today we are delighted to be joined by Yigal Palmor.
Yigal is the head of the International Relations Unit and foreign policy advisor to the chairman at the Jewish Agency for Israel. He was the longest serving spokesperson and head of the press bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel from 2008 to 2014. Prior to this post, he served stints in Israel's embassies in Madrid and in Paris, served as deputy director of the European Institutions Department, and later as director of the director in the Syria and Lebanese department. He was a spokesperson of the Israeli delegations in a number of peace summits, and in 2013 he was elected best government spokesperson in a survey of Israeli journalists. Yigal, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thought it'd be good to start just touching upon kind of your upbringing, and kind of your family story, and then maybe touching upon your time at university as well.
Okay, my upbringing. I was born in Jerusalem. My parents had recently immigrated from Romania, where they were stuck for years. They didn't get any Aliyah permits, any immigration permits from the communist regime. They just managed to get the permits and make Aliyah with their parents' families. So I was born in Jerusalem. My father joined the foreign ministry a few years later. And then I grew up in a small neighborhood in Jerusalem, surrounded by many Olim Chadashim, many new immigrants. When I was 8 and a half, we moved to Belgium, where my father was appointed first secretary of the Israeli embassy. I was very lucky in Belgium because not only did I learn French by going to the local French-speaking Jewish school, Athénée Maïmonide. Here's my tribute to my school and primary school. I'm mentioning them now. So not only did I learn French, but I met Ben Gurion. I have a picture with Ben Gurion because he came on an unofficial visit, and I was lucky enough uh, to to see him and shake his hand. And that was the first time I went on TV speaking for Israel. There was a children's program about, countries around the world presented to Belgian children. So when I was 10 or 11, I was sent by my school with a fellow schoolmate, a girl schoolmate, to represent Israel in that program. So we spoke about Israel to Belgian children, and it was the first time I felt like I was speaking for my country and describing it for the benefit of the general public. After that, we moved to Norway. Norway was a different adventure. Well, colder, of course, but that was precisely the time of the Lillehammer affair. For those of you who are not familiar with the Lillehammer affair, in 1973, a Mossad team assassinated a Palestinian terrorist in Norway, only it turned out that they got the wrong man. It was an innocent Moroccan waiter, and the team got caught almost red-handed, brought to court and imprisoned, condemned to several years of prison. So it was my dad's job to see to it that they get all their rights and to try and achieve, to lobby for amnesty for them. Meanwhile, we had the right to visit them almost any time. They were allowed to come and spend Shabbat with us on a number of occasions. And speaking of Pesach, my most memorable Seder of Pesach was in the Norwegian jail, in the man's jail, with the two Israeli Mossad agents and the families who were allowed to come and join us for the Seder. So you can imagine that when we read the Haggadah and spoke about next year in Jerusalem and coming out of slavery to freedom, mi'avdut lecharut, it had a very, very special meaning at that time. And then we returned to Jerusalem. I attended a local high school. I joined the army in 1979. Um, I did several things, but this is not the time to talk about them. And when I left the army, I joined Hebrew U. I majored in general linguistics and Hispanic and Latin American studies. And then I joined the academic uh, cadet course of the Foreign Ministry, 1986. I was sent to Madrid in 1990. I was appointed second secretary and then first secretary. And 1990 was the best time to be in Madrid, especially as an Israeli representative, because we were preparing a number of things, not just Israel's participation at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics and at the 92 World Expo in Seville, but also in the um, in the wide-ranging commemoration of the 5 centuries since the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. That was a really memorable year with a multitude of cultural events, of official events, presidential visits, royal visits, academic conferences, and whatnot. So you can now question me about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. I think I'm ready to answer anything about the Spanish Inquisition. I always expect the Spanish Inquisition. That much I took from that year. We returned to Israel. I was appointed deputy spokesperson. Oh, of course, I forgot that while in Madrid, 1991, we had the historic peace conference, the Madrid Peace Conference, which was convened after the Gulf War and after Saddam Hussein fired missiles at Israel. That we were reminded of that a couple of days ago when the Iranians fired missiles at us. We've already been there. It was a different situation at the time. And the Americans convened a major regional peace conference after that in Madrid. And I was lucky enough to be a member of the Israeli delegation and to sit there on the side of Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir and then Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, a certain very young Benjamin Netanyahu.
Thank you.
Wow.
With his freshly wedded wife, Sarah. They were young wedded. Anyway, so that was Madrid, and then returned to Israel. I was deputy spokesman for 3 years, and then was appointed as head of information and communications to France, to our embassy in Paris, where we had a major commemoration of Israel's 50th Independence Day, with the presence of the president, the prime minister, most government ministers, and many members of parliament and senate. An unprecedented event, which was not to be repeated, unfortunately, but it was a great event. And then the second Intifada broke out, and we were right there in Paris. I think you know how French Jews experienced first years of the Intifada and what we had to deal with the media. I returned to Israel in 2002, worked in the European Affairs Department, and then I was head of the North Africa, Syria, and Lebanon Department. I traveled to North Africa, to Tunisia, Morocco, Mauritania, and met with several high-ranking officials. And then war broke out in Lebanon. My wife always tells me that anywhere I go, there's war. So maybe I should get an appointment somewhere very, very far away to take war and mayhem away from us. So yeah, Second Lebanon War, I did a lot of media opportunities also. And then I was appointed chief spokesman of the Foreign Ministry in 2008. As such, I had to go through three military operations in Gaza. You may remember Cast Lead and Protective Edge, and so on and so on. Also, the famous Turkish flotilla affair happened on my guard, and Arab Spring, which brought, curiously enough, hundreds of journalists to Israel I mean, it's the Arab Spring. Why come to Israel? Well, we can discuss the media in Israel later if you want. And in 2014, I felt it was enough. I was the longest serving spokesman for the foreign ministry. I didn't really want to go abroad again. So I joined the Jewish Agency. I worked with Natan Sharansky and then with Isaac Herzog, now with Doron Almog. And that's more or less it.
Thank you so much. Circling back to your early part of your career, what led you to want to become a diplomat and work in public service?
So I think I gave you a few hints. Look, the truth is that when I was still studying at university, I wasn't really thinking about becoming a diplomat. I was thinking about anything but a diplomat because I felt I already knew what it was like. I knew it from the inside. I lived as a diplomat's child, and I've already been on TV representing Israel and so on and so on. So it was like, I've been there, I've done that. I felt I really needed to move on. But then at some point, I saw that they were calling for trials, if I may call it like that. And I don't know why. I wanted to go and see and prove to myself that I could go through and be selected, and then I'll tell them I'm not interested. But the more I passed, the more phases I passed, the more I felt that this was the right place for me. I really felt that I was really doing what my calling was, and it felt so right that I decided to go through with it. I was admitted, and rest is history.
For sure. If we could just jump to your time at the foreign ministry, I think there's a few bits I think would be interesting to touch upon. Um, and firstly, I'd like to preface it. You said when we started that there were no major areas kind of that we couldn't go into. So I thought make a quick question about Brazil and some
I saw that coming.
because I know back in July 2014, I think you called Brazil an economic and cultural giant, but a diplomatic dwarf, and that made quite a few waves. Could you just maybe explain kind of the genesis of that comment, how you dealt
Sure.
with it, and kind of what came of it?
Sure. So 2014, we are again drawn into fighting with Hamas in Gaza after Hamas has fired hundreds of missiles on Israel. And it was obvious to the international community that we were attacked again and again, that Hamas did not heed any calls for restraint from Arab countries, from the international community. And so we had to intervene. It was obvious for anyone, and indeed many countries sent their ambassadors to the southern region, to the places most affected by Hamas rockets. The French ambassador went to Ashdod and Ashkelon, where many French citizens live, French olim. The Argentinian ambassador went to a number of kibbutzim where there are many Argentinians, and so on and so on. But the Brazilian ambassador was withdrawn from Israel as a sign of protest, as if everything was our fault, and the Brazilian government was protesting us. And before we knew it, they launched a number of very hostile diplomatic moves and initiatives at the UN. Before any Arab country even imagined it could do anything against Israel in the international arena, Brazil was there talking other Latin American countries into joining them and withdrawing their ambassadors and so on. So we asked our ambassador in Brasilia to ask for an urgent meeting with the foreign minister to have a conversation, but they refused to talk to him. So the foreign minister wanted to call his Brazilian counterpart to have a talk at higher level. They refused to take the call. There was no possibility to get through to them and to even talk, to deliver a message, to listen to them, to tell them how we felt, to explain our point of view, nothing at all. And it somehow also influenced their media We were flooded with world media interviewing, going to the South and explaining what was happening and interviewing us to get our point of view. The Brazilian media was not there. So we thought, they wouldn't refuse to talk to President Shimon Peres, who is a worldwide celebrity and a known peace activist. All his life was in search of peace. And why wouldn't the Brazilian president talk to him? So the presidency tried to connect with the Brazilian presidency, but the Brazilian president would not take the call, even though on the Israeli side, they said Peres was stepping down and this was his farewell call to world leaders, and he wanted to talk to the Brazilian president as well. Didn't matter. They didn't answer. They didn't pick up the phone. There was no way to get through and to talk. So the idea, the foreign ministry was, let's have the spokesman say something that will shock them into agreeing to talk to us, right? Let's shake the whole thing a little bit. And so I was instructed to go out there and shock the Brazilians into picking up the phone. So I called my friend Herb Canon, who was diplomatic correspondent of the Jerusalem Post, and I said, look, this is for the record. This is how we see Brazil's attitude. They're part of the problem. They're not part of, they pretend to bring solutions, but they're part of the problem and they can't do anything right. And unfortunately, this only proves that Brazil is an economic and cultural giant, but a diplomatic dwarf. Indeed, this sent shockwaves throughout Latin America. Many other countries in Latin America applauded, and our ambassador in Brasilia called me and said, you don't understand. All the foreign ambassadors here are calling me and saying, congratulations, someone told them. He was called by the foreign minister, and we had to talk. It didn't really do much good because they were intent on moving forward with their very hostile initiatives at the UN, but at least we could talk and exchange point of view. And at least the Brazilian media called me and asked me to present Israel's point of view about the conflict. So those were the benefits. Now, the diplomatic dwarf apparently was received as a valid metaphor by the Brazilian media, by journalists, correspondents, pundits, and I have to say that I'm amazed to see how it has survived to this day. It is still being used by the Brazilian media, still being quoted in the context of the current conflict and in the context of the very controversial statements by the Brazilian president. So, I think I contributed something to the Brazilian political discourse.
Yeah, wow. And so what led to you leaving the foreign ministry in that same year in 2014?
Actually, I said about 6 months prior to the conflict in Gaza, I said to my superiors that I was going to leave because I felt that 6 years in that job exerted too much stress on me personally, on my family, on my personal life. And, I felt that I did everything that was interesting to do as far as I was concerned in the diplomatic career. I took part in press and peace conferences. I spoke to the world media. I represented Israel in Arab countries and in Europe. I did quite a lot, and I thought it was time to maybe try and do something else, something that would allow me to stay closer to my family, and at the same time, still do more or less what I was good at doing. So that's how I joined the Jewish Agency, and there you go. I think my wife and kids were very happy.
If I might push you slightly, I know when you left the ministry, that led to another kind of whole wave of other resignations, which at the time was seen to kind of weaken the ministry under, I believe, from memory, I think it was Avigdor Lieberman at the time. Did you ever feel, particularly while at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and during your time more widely as a diplomat and a spokesperson, that your principles were compromised based on what you were having to say as a diplomat and spokesperson? And did that play any role in why you chose to leave at that particular time?
It did. It did. The truth is that the minister completely ignored me throughout his 5 years in office, and that left me uh, a little bit frustrated at first, but it provided me with a lot of freedom, a lot of wiggle room, a lot of freedom to maneuver and to present Israel's case in the best way that I could, and to speak freely. Well, of course, I had to represent government policy, but there are many ways to present your case. There's the convincing way, and there's the official way. So I mostly chose the convincing way as best I could, and I felt that things were not going to improve. I mean, after these 6 years, I saw a lot of politicking at the office and in government from very, very close. And I thought that even though I managed to preserve my personal integrity while speaking for the government, at that time, I thought it would become a lot more difficult and maybe even impossible in the foreseeable
Yeah.
future, and that maybe I shouldn't be there. I didn't want to take, some of my colleagues in these situations take a side job where they don't really need to be in the front speaking for a government policy. They just do something that's more technical, and it's not necessarily the hardcore of Israeli diplomacy. I always wanted to do the hardcore stuff. And the hardcore stuff I felt was becoming more challenging to digest and to defend. And even though it was okay at that time, I felt there was a process going on with things becoming ever more difficult and ever more frustrating. And I didn't want to be there when things could become impossible for me to take part in.
Thank you very much. And sounds like a difficult decision, but thank you very much for sharing. But I think listen, for our listeners, we're recording this on the 15th of April. And so we're only about 48 hours after Iran launched its unprecedented direct attack on Israel. And I'm sure you obviously had a sleepless night on Saturday night, as did Jewish people around the world. And so that kind of threw a bit of a spanner in our works in terms of what we originally planned for this podcast. But I thought it'd be good if we just maybe turned now straight to current affairs and drawing upon your expertise. So yeah, Levona, should we turn to kind of the question of Iran?
Yeah, so getting straight in there with what do you expect would be the end game for Iran?
That is a huge question. I know one thing. I know that the Iranian regime uh, truly believes that they are on a mission from God, not just to spread the word among Muslims and among non-Muslims, not just to dominate the Muslim world, but also to erase Israel from the map. This has been clearly expounded on by Ayatollah Khomeini and his successors, and the Iranians make no mystery of their ultimate intentions of destroying Israel, the Zionist regime, or I think they call it the false regime or something like that. They seem to think that we're not even Jews, not Jews. So Zionist means just some sort of colonial enterprise meant to annoy the Muslims and humiliate them and nothing else. Not even in the name of Judaism or anything, just to annoy them and to take their land or something. And they have this messianic view of their role, their destiny to lead the Muslim world in this holy war against Israel and defeat Israel and retake possession of the holy places of Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa Mosque for Islam. they also mean to take possession of Mecca and Medina, but that's a different story and it concerns another country. But as far as we're concerned, their end game is to destroy Israel. And if you saw their reaction to their attack a couple of days ago, first of all, you could see all the members of parliament joining and cheering and jeering and shouting death to Israel in ecstasy at the parliament. There's also a Jewish member of parliament. I don't even want to think how he felt on that occasion. But that was one thing. And the other thing is, I've read interviews by Iranian officials, and they're saying, yes, it was a great success. We managed to shatter Israel's invincible defense system. And by doing that, we made the Zionist regime, crumble from inside. So they believe that we will simply collapse from the inside and then disappear and be washed away. So from their point of view, that's the end game, strike Israel again and again until it collapses and disappears, because we're an artificial regime that cannot sustain such attacks and that cannot last for very long. And they have their own explanation. And this is why it's impossible to reason with them. Impossible to reason. Another thing is, people tell us, friendly countries have been telling us, you don't have to fear the Iranians getting all nuclear, because they will not strike you. There is a mutually assured destruction. They know that you can hit them back. And my view is, yeah, this would work if they were thinking rationally, but this is the regime that introduced suicide bombings into the Middle East. This is the regime that came up with the religious justification of suicide in holy war. So this regime will be deterred by some damage that we can cause them? Of course not. Of course not. So this is why I think Iran poses a real danger, not just to Israel, not just to the Middle East, but to half the globe, at least half the globe, if not beyond. We remember their terror attacks in Argentina. We were reminded of those attacks just this week by the Argentinian Supreme Court of Appeals. And there is no end game with Iran. We need to wait for the regime to be replaced from the inside by the Iranians themselves. And until that time, whether it happens next year or next century, we just need to protect ourselves and not allow to be bullied.
Well, on the question of protecting yourselves, and before we move on to other questions about Saudi Arabia and so much more, do you think Israel is going to respond in some way, shape, or form? And if so, what do you think that response looks like?
Again, excellent question. Everybody wants to know that, and I can't predict the future, obviously. But the way I feel the mood here in government and in the public, there will be a response, not in the immediate term. There will be a response. I don't think you will see the Israeli Air Force flying straight to Tehran and bombing stuff. Of course not. There will be some sort of response, and when it comes, we'll all know that it happened. I think that, again, I'm not privy to the deliberations of the war cabinet. I think that they've all agreed that some kind of response must be opposed to what happened. But we need to choose the time. We should not be dragged by Iran to an exchange of tit for tat, because then they can set the time and the place for this confrontation, and we should choose the time, the moment, and the method that best suits our interest and not their interest. So I believe there will be a response, but I can't say what, where, or when.
Thank you.
Thank you. And kind of bringing it back to October 7th, now just over 6 months ago, what role in terms of Saudi-Israel relationships do you think played in prompting that?
in prompting the October 7th attack, you mean?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I know that Hamas said, or Hamas officials said that they were worried by the perspective of Israeli-Saudi relations warming up, and maybe they would be forgotten, sidelined, and so on. But I think it's all nonsense. I think they prepared the attack because they wanted to attack us, because that's what they do. I mean, Hamas doesn't care very much for welfare and development of the Palestinian people. They use all their resources to prepare for attacks and yet more attacks, and then suicide bombings and firing rockets and ground attacks and so on and so on. That's all they do with all the money they could get, or to dig tunnels and build underground bunkers and so on and so on. So they attacked us because they prepared for this for a long time, and they thought the moment was right for operational reasons. And then, there were diplomatic circumstances. So they said, yes, of course, it all had to do with Saudi Arabia, maybe striking a deal with Israel, and the Emirates having established diplomatic ties, and so on and so on. But this was just a pretext. This is just a pretext. Their real aim is, again, to attack Israel, to destroy Israel, to replace it not with an independent Palestinian state, but with an Islamic republic that would one day unite with other Islamic republics around the Muslim world. And at the end of the day, the caliphate would be restored. So we're talking about establishing an Islamic state, which has nothing to do with the national aspirations of Palestinians from the PLO or the Palestinian Authority or other movements. And with this perspective, of course, Saudi Arabia can be considered a hindrance, but not really a reason to act or not to act. I think that at the end of the day, they managed to embarrass the Saudis, but I think that it became even clearer to Saudi Arabia and to other moderate Arab countries that Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood are an extreme and immediate danger, not just for Israel, but also for them. And there will be a new format of Middle East alliances against Islamic extremism as preached and professed by the likes of Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood.
So Saudi Arabia have also said that they will only agree to normalize relations if Israel recognizes or puts in place plans to recognize a Palestinian state. Mm-hmm. Do you see this as a reality?
Well, first of all, it's a reality that they're asking for this, and that they need a step forward, not the real establishment of an existing Palestinian state, but at least some real steps towards a real negotiation for Palestinian independence. They really need that, yes. But will it happen? I have to say that the October 7th attack dealt a death blow to a whole segment of Israeli politics. People who preached for peace agreement based on the two-state solution are now on the defensive, to put it mildly, because all Israelis have now suffered in their flesh the vicinity of a Palestinian entity that was, in fact, independent, that was not under Israeli control or under Israeli occupation. Even if they were pressured by the Israeli army on the border, they were not occupied and not controlled by Israel. And so the argument of those who oppose a Palestinian state has now become even stronger. I mean, who would agree to have a Palestinian state as its neighbor? Let's not forget that we're not talking about distances such as the distance between the UK and France, or even between France and Germany. We are really sharing the same land. We live on the same land, whether we like it or not. And if we have to divide it into two states, it will be It will be really a house next to a house. It will be a courtyard next to a courtyard, a field next to a field. Who would feel safe under such conditions with no guarantees on the other side? And that's why I think it would be extremely difficult for any Israeli leader to come forward today with the idea of a negotiated two-state solution, even though I understand there's an organization now on the well, you can see the polls. In the polls, the left in Israel's practically washed off the map. But the left-wing forces are now reorganizing, and who's to tell what will happen on election day whenever elections come? I can't predict what will happen, but I can tell you that the idea of peace based on two independent states living side by side has grown highly unpopular in Israel after October. Not that it was the leading idea before October 7th, but it really sunk to a new low after October 7th. And it's very difficult to see how it can be re-legitimized in Israeli discourse, maybe with a promise of peace with Saudi Arabia, maybe, or something even larger, maybe.
Thank you. We touched on mildly about help from US recently this weekend with the drones being sent over to Iran. And if we are expecting Trump to become the next US president, how would you think that this impacts the region?
Trump is the most unpredictable personality in international politics and probably in American politics too. But as far as we're concerned, what matters is that if Trump wins, we have an unpredictable president who may or may not be well disposed towards the Israeli government. We don't really know. He has given contradictory signs, who may or may not want to intervene in the Middle East to defend Israel or to help Israel or to help Saudi Arabia or the Emirates or any other, or Egypt against an Iranian challenge or something. We really don't know what he will do. And this unpredictability will foster instability. And instability in turn can lead to many, many things, none of which I can predict, but none of which I think is desirable. Instability can in the Middle East can lead to an expansion of Iranian proxies and cronies, or some, like the Houthis in Yemen. Who saw them coming? And here they are, standing their ground for years and years, and now taking part in the conflict in Gaza. Who would have thought? I mean, it sounds like a caricature, those people from faraway Yemen who can hardly manage their own rifles are now firing missiles on Israel. Well, that's reality now in the Middle East. And with Trump, we are adding another instability factor because he's so unpredictable. So I really don't know what to say other than the Middle East really needs stability and security, and not the opposites.
For sure, for sure. One more question on the current war. Firstly, well, sorry, well, I'll be a two-part question. How do we get the hostages returned, and how does this war end?
If I knew how to get the hostages returned, believe me, I would not make. I would not hide my opinion from my government. Look, there are two contradictory opinions. One is put even more military pressure on Hamas until they break down, and they will just beg you to take the hostages and leave them be. That's one view. The other view is, no, we need to negotiate and agree to practically any kind of deal as long as we can set free as many hostages as possible. With an understanding that we may not, one way or another, we may not get all the hostages because, well, not only did many probably die in captivity, but apparently Hamas is saying that they don't really know the whereabouts of all the hostages, and they won't be able to collect them all and to deliver them should we reach a deal. And I'm afraid that sounds credible because the raid on southwest Negev was conducted not just by Hamas, but by other organizations who followed suit and by thousands of civilians who came after the gunmen of the organizations and also took captives. And in all the mayhem that followed, it is quite possible that many hostages were lost, if you see what I mean, and
Sure.
never came under the control of an organization who could take responsibility for them one way or another. So how to get hostages free? Well, either by negotiating a deal or by putting more pressure. The Israeli government is trying it both ways now. When the war broke out, I said on the record that there were no good options now. No good options. Either we go all out to destroy Hamas, or we decide to do everything to free the hostages. We can't have it both ways, and we may not have it anyway. But any choice that we would make would mean relinquishing the other choice, the other possibility, the other goal. Okay, if we want to release the hostages, we need we need Hamas in control, obviously. If we want to destroy Hamas, we may not be able to get the hostages. And this is the tragedy of the situation. There are no good options, no good options. And how to end the war? Well, every war ends with a political deal, with achieving a new political situation to which all sides agree, whether they are compelled or forced to agree to it, or whether they are on the side that imposes its will, but there is a new configuration. All wars end with a new political configuration. What we really need to see from our government is a political goal, a political plan. And for the moment, if there is such a plan, it has not been revealed or divulged or leaked to the public, so we don't know if there is a plan. This is why I find it very difficult to tell you how I think this will end, because it could end with the demise of Hamas and an Israeli reoccupation of Gaza, or something happens to Hamas, Israel withdraws, but who's in charge? I don't know. An inter-Arab force, maybe Egypt, just Egypt, maybe an international force, maybe a Palestinian representative of some sort. All of these ideas were raised, and I don't know if the Israeli government has made its choice at this point. So we'll have to wait and see.
Wow, thank you. And focusing more towards the future in Israeli politics and politics in general, how do you think we can promote more female leadership in politics and diplomatic roles?
First of all, we need to see more women in choosing these careers. The more there are women in politics and in diplomacy, the easier it will be to promote them to decision making spots and to the higher ranks. You see what I mean? If you have in the government 20 male ministers and one female, it would be very artificial to promote this female minister to an important role. But if we have plenty of members of parliament, members of Knesset, and ministers who are female, it will be natural for them to play an important role. So we begin by by securing a massive presence of females, of women in politics, in diplomacy, in business, in everything. And once there's a massive presence, things will, I think, evolve naturally. More naturally, it will be much more. It will be easier, and it will be more organic to overcome the obstacles of sexism and conservatism in terms of allowing women to play a role.
Thank you so much, Yigal. We're coming towards the end of our time for this episode of the podcast, but we thought we'd end with some quick fire questions for you, if that's all right.
Okay.
So we'll probably take one question each. Start off for a quick, I'm sure an easy one. Times of Israel or the Jerusalem Post?
Oh, I'm going to offend some of my best friends and make others happy, but I will say Times of Israel.
And another probably easy one, Tel Aviv or Jerusalem?
You've heard my biography. It's Jerusalem without hesitation.
If you could be an ambassador to any country in the world, which one would it be and why?
France, clearly France. I'm a Francophone. I'm imbued with French culture, I have to admit, and it would be France.
Wow. Biggest role model?
Johan Cruyff,
Very
the
nice.
legendary superstar of Dutch football, and also a great friend of Israel and the Jewish people, and also a huge leader of men, and someone who really played the team. There were many football stars who can do wonders with the ball, but they don't make the other players greater for playing with them. And he was really playing team. He made the others look better.
And final one, favorite Jewish food. I'm happy to accept answers that are related to Pesach, given the time of year as well.
Favorite Jewish what? I'm sorry?
Favorite Jewish food.
Favorite Jewish food. Uh, favorite Jewish food. Maybe, yeah, latkes in Hanukkah. Definitely. Latkes, anytime.
Brilliant.
Very nice. I can definitely relate as well. I
Mm.
probably would have gone something maybe more like a chulent type, something a bit more filling, I think. But or maybe
Yeah.
some kugel. I don't know. Anyways, I digress.
And I have to admit that I'm the only person in my family who actually love matzahs. I really like it. I don't eat it because I have to, because I really like it. And they all stare at me with wonder every year in Pesach. They see me finishing off the matzahs on the table at the Seder throughout Pesach and after Pesach, all the leftovers. I keep eating them. What can I tell you? I think it's one of the best Jewish foods too.
Wow.
Yigal, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you for your thoughts on everything from Saudi Arabia to providing us with the much needed insight to the situation, the ongoing situation with Iran, to your background, to your story, and your journey into diplomacy and your really, really phenomenal career. So thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. And thank you to Levona for coming and joining me today on hosting this podcast. And thank you to everybody at home for listening. Please stay tuned for more podcasts and keep up to date via our social media at UJS_UK. Thank you again, Yigal, and we look forward to seeing everybody very soon.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you.